Naruto was a fairly niche anime that flew under the radar a couple years back, but regardless of whether or not you actually give a shit about the series, it's had some games. The ones I want to talk about specifically are the Nintendo DS RPG trio, which was culled to a duo in the West entitled Path of the Ninja. The first of the three didn't start on the DS and was actually a Game Boy Advance title stranded in Japan and was later ported, localized, and came packing some major changes. The most obvious difference was, of course, touchscreen interactivity, but combat was also estranged. The DS version featured standard turn-based combat as well as a grid system with area of effect abilities and interchangeable formations based on your own grid positioning, whereas the Game Boy Advance title had none of that. But it did have a bar which displayed turn order. It's pretty cool. The few extra pixels afforded by the DS screen allowed for a cleaner user interface and less goblin battle sprites, and overall I'd say the changes justify its existence. Path of the Ninja starts just after Naruto acquires the Shadow Clone Jutsu and is placed into a team with Sasuke and Sakura, the beautifoo. There's not a great deal of filler, but certain parts are padded here and there because they needed to be. Effectively, your major points throughout the series are the Zabuza encounter, the Chunin exams, chasing the Sound 4 to get Sasuke back, and well, that's it really. The game runs until the end of the exam, so with two major plot points under its belt, there was an obvious need for a bit of padding, but it's surprisingly not overdone and ends up a modest length for an RPG. The mid to late game sends you back through older maps to bump the playtime a bit, but a straight run wouldn't be any longer than 8 hours or so, and that's all it needed to be. None of the filler's really worth talking about, but the way the Ninja Village is structured around missions lends itself to that type of content, and as a result, the few extras don't feel too out of place. It might have been a decent idea to backload some better filler, as retreading old maps to collect Jiraiya's goon stash is pretty shit, and the fairly strict adherence to the narrative makes for some disjointed progression. The game ends after Gaara gets sand in his vagina and turns into a giant raccoon, which is a great stopping point, though I imagine now that Naruto's concluded, a bigger, more comprehensive RPG would be achievable, and if you're a series fan, you might feel a bit blue-balled. For a majority of playtime, you control the OG Team 7, that's Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura, with Kakashi as an occasional stand-in for story events. During the late game scenarios, you're given the gift of adding Lee, Shikamaru, and Neji to the party, which is sick because they're the best cunts and I fucking hate Sakura. Despite Kakashi being selectively available, any combat scenario that includes him is heavily scripted and ends at an arbitrary point, effectively serving as a cutscene that almost makes you feel like you participated. These characters all share a bond with Naruto, which can be increased by slurping noodles. Visiting Ichiraku Ramen, you'll sporadically be given frothy new broths to suckle upon and can chug noodle water with a bro. The system's mostly guesswork, and bonds aren't worth the damage trade-off, as there's only a slight chance they'll trigger if both players use a standard attack. And quite frankly, if you're ever not spamming jutsu, you're not playing very efficiently, as recovery points are everywhere. Despite this, combat isn't solely a mindless mash fest. Characters can be positioned in a formation on a 4x3 grid, with certain arrangements granting stat bonuses. The rows themselves are also subject to what you'd expect of a row system. Characters in front do more damage, but are also subject to more, whereas the back row is the inverse. It's not so hard that you can't just wing it on the front lines for extra attack and speed through enemies, but on occasion you can get absolutely blasted for being overly aggressive, particularly in story-heavy areas where, due to narrative interference, you may find your team has mysteriously vanished. Each character has attacks which can hit single enemies, areas, or the entire field, with foes appearing on their own 4x3 grid. Any given encounter can be aided by actually engaging your neurons to optimize turns, but again, it doesn't require it. It's less, how do I win, and more, how do I win faster? Being on the DS, gimmicky touchscreen shit was prioritized, with certain attacks requiring you to rub one out to an explosive end. The faster you rub, the bigger the build-up, and the harder your pop. Furiously gliding your stylus across the touchscreen increases a tiered power meter, and each tier raises the chakra requirement, as well as the damage output and effectiveness. I fucking hate it! The button inputs on the Game Boy Advance version are far better than ruining my touchscreen for 5 extra damage, and it seems to chug chakra at a disproportionate rate to how much the technique is actually boosted. I still did it every time though. It was more of a superstition than anything. I felt like I was missing out if I didn't. Each character also has an assortment of elemental attacks, and if you know anything about Naruto, you know that there are 5 core elements and characters are only supposed to control like 1 or 2. But it is a decent way of incorporating those techniques as stand-ins for magic. Path of the Ninja is okay. It's short, it follows the story fairly closely, and the gameplay's passable for a JRPG, but they can do better. The question is, will they? A year after the first game released in Japan, a sequel arose titled Naruto RPG 2 Chidori vs Rasengan. Unfortunately, it would remain Japanese only and is still without fan translation, though it's such a simple game it doesn't really need one. I could only speculate as to why this wasn't localized, but I do have a theory. Now when I say this, know that I'm only like 99% serious, but hear me out. The user interface. The original Naruto RPG on the Game Boy Advance didn't have this weird touchscreen wheel for obvious reasons, and it's fucking ugly, dumb, and should kill itself. With the second title releasing before the localization of the first game, and following cues from the Game Boy Advance entry, it too did not have this ugly ring of commands. By January 2008, all the non-filler episodes of Naruto had aired in English, so all the content featured within was ostensibly fair game, but RPG 3, or Path of the Ninja 2, released in its place. I put it to you here today that they were too lazy to retroactively add this ugly spectacle and skip the game entirely. Schizo shit aside, the need for a user interface had become increasingly redundant anyway, as shortcuts were added for battle commands. Pressing X followed by A would cause a character to defend, Y changes position, as well as simply tapping the desired space on the touchscreen. I don't know why they didn't go harder on this and fully remove on-screen battle commands entirely. It seems like unnecessary bloat when you've crafted an otherwise stripped-down functional system that serves the exact same purpose. There are a bunch of new characters, and most of the good ones are forced in as a part of the story. These include other tune-in groups, as well as the Sand Ninja, and because of the character influx, the party system required a bit of a spiff up, and up-spiffed it became. The primary party consists of 3 characters with a back row of 3 separate fellas, and once a primary position falls, they're replaced with a reserve. Effectively taking 6 characters into combat would make any battle in the previous title even more of a pushover, which is why they ramped up the difficulty this time, and it was pretty steep. Similar to its predecessor, the narrative events are quite condensed, and it seems that the difficulty curve might have been a bit too thick as a result, like there wasn't enough filler to justify how far the next areas jump in stats. While I love a comfy RPG, getting your shit kicked in an otherwise fairly generic experience is always humbling, and here actually forced me to rethink how I approached combat, in that I had to stop mashing A a couple times. General encounters are pretty easy and largely serve as experience fodder, as combat hasn't changed in any major way. The DS rubbing games still suck a fat stylus, and outside the fresh party distribution, it's functionally the same as the first title. Our new friends become friendlier with gifts strewn throughout dungeons, but this system shares the same issues as slurping the noodle, in that combo attacks are rarely if ever seen, so the entire system is still a mostly pointless guessing game. Not to mention any system where you aren't owed intercourse by virtue of surface level praise is not a system I want to participate in. What's that? Was that what? How old? Nah, cut this out. Speaking of maps, stage progression is also worse. The first title gave the player the ability to walk on water, break rocks, and jump up cliff faces as terrain movement upgrades, and they weren't game changers, but breathed some new life into previously explored areas. Not only was this effective for gating story progression, but also served as a way to get some neat gear if you felt like backtracking, and the masterful beauty was that it was all executed with the single press of the A button. All of those traversal elements still exist, but are segregated and contextualized further with the integration of summon companions. Instead of walking up to the traversal trigger and press an A like a savage, the player is required to open the menu, navigate to Naruto's skills, select the correct aminal to summon for the desired effect, and close the menu, after which A can finally be pressed. The summon beasts are a welcome sight, as they're quite a large factor to the world of Naruto, but using them in this way ultimately turns an effortless inclusion into a constant annoyance. They also fucked up the story by including way too much of it. The game is easily half cutscene, significantly more than the first one, and I noticed it more because it was all funny moon squiggles. Chasing the Sound 4 was well done, and featured some creative fillery liberties to cram a whole host of characters in. The dungeons are visually and structurally interesting, the bosses are incredibly tough, and there are random surprises throughout the pursuit, such as acquiring Gaara, who inspired loser children everywhere to make Linkin Park AMVs, and get face tattoos. I could not for the life of me figure out how to trigger any of the post-game content, other than recruiting a few additional characters, but they start at level 1, and the game's already over, so like, why bother? Where the fuck was Shino when I was like fighting Kimimaro and shit, when I actually needed him? Now he's all used up and cummy. Overall, some solid improvements, some not so solid improvements, and my only hope for the third title is a refinement of the cool shit and more Rock Lee.
Naruto, I'm on my way. Naruto, I'll be okay.
Naruto RPG 3, known in the West as Path of the Ninja 2, is the final entry in the series, and that is in no way reflective of the quality. The game opens with an old bloke and his granddaughter discovering that evil spirits have been unsealed, so the wrinkly boy urges her to seek help from the ninja of Konoha. He chucks himself off a cliff to avoid being consumed by invisible demons, which you'd assume is a fit of Alzheimer's, but she goes anyway. Arriving in town, the buff meth head collective attempt to snatch the girl, but Naruto and company rock up just in time to play hero. During this scene, some of the core cast are reintroduced, which is strange, but hints that it may have been intended for people who weren't overly familiar with the series. But that's dumb. Why the fuck would you play a Naruto RPG, no less a sequel, if you don't even know who Kakashi is? As an extension of that, I'd hate to think anyone watching this video is a lore pleb. Like, bro, if you can't tell me the difference between a Byakugan and a Sharingan, you're probably a virgin, let's be real. But the girl gives us a mirror and says that if all 5 fall into the enemy's hands, they'll unseal a big fish. I don't know why we need mirrors, like, surely a fishing rod or a fuck ton of plastic could do the trick. Drop an oil tanker in the middle of the ocean, the guy would be fucking dead and his offspring would be genetic freaks for decades. After striking fear in our child heroes with the threat of a real big fish concert, the girl informs them of a place where her grandpa said explicitly never to go, which is more than likely where a mirror is. Dumb bitch. Upon collecting a mirror, the party's forced to relive a major plot point from the series, and since there are only 4 to collect, that conveniently fits the 4 big events. Yeah, every significant boss encounter is just a retread of the canonical shit we did in the past too. I love how creative they got with the filler, you know, it really makes you feel like an urban teenage ninja. I said ninja. The first mirror is a re-battle on the big bridge, the second is trapping sand raccoons, the third's a scuffle with an emo and his pet shark, and the final mirror forces Naruto to kiss Sasuke behind the Hokage statues. Filler in media is a unique opportunity, one where the writers can craft a brand new narrative with relatively few strings attached, as the only real rule is that everything has to return to the way it was before the journey began. Seeing our beloved heroes in fresh new scenarios, which may be exclusive to a particular game or book or whatever, is an exciting prospect. Which makes it incredibly disappointing that the narrative here is just old plot points punctuated by a decent source of protein and mercury. Then, the final dungeon contains 4 balls you've got to collect, and each one comes with a boss encounter, but it's the same red puppet each time. Finally, you engage the giant catfish with his arms and little skelly legs, which somehow kills the antagonist as well. The end. I fucking hate anime and video games. Outside of the horrid narrative, there's also the horrid map traversal, as the encounter rate is through the roof, and certain maps force a transitionary minigame where you've got to auto-run through a brief gauntlet of foes every single time. These events do give prizes based on how well you do, and completing them perfectly unlocks some scrolls that give you late game items, but if you want to go to the sand village, you gotta flap those arms back, put your head down, and speed through a spectrum of snakes, and it's not very good. The rewards attempt to offset the tedium from the amount of times you'll have to run these sections, but they're not even good. It should have been skippable after the first run. That's far from the only oddly contextual map issue, as Path of the Ninja 2 kept the summon animals from the former game, which were already stupid, but also added sections in which you control a dog and crawl around a short map. They feature no encounters or obstacles, it's genuinely just a time burn, as Kiba and his dog pal are always with you when these scenes arise. In addition, some dungeons contain huge gaps which require Lee to give Naruto a bit of a pep talk before you gotta scream some sort of spurgy mantra into the microphone to clear. I get wanting to utilize the gimmicky hardware of the DS, some games do it pretty well, but what's stopping me from screaming a gambit of colourful slurs, or just, I don't know, pressing the button? Like, what does yelling "believe it" add to the game other than secondhand embarrassment? You know what would have been a way better idea? Like executing an attack and then instead of rotating your dumb fucking stylus like an asshole, you'd instead scream the jutsu name like an asshole. Like imagine actually yelling "Katon Gokagyu no Jutsu" or whatever the fucking English variant, fire style touch the stove jutsu. Like it's the next best thing to throwing up the gang signs. Then there's the duel dungeon, where 2 alternating parties tackle 2 separate paths. Instead of requiring a meaningful back and forth, you just hit 4 story triggers until you're switched automatically. It's a regular dungeon with extra steps. Speaking of extra steps, it still features the ugly battle wheel from the first game, as well as removing the shortcuts from RPG 2 just to make sure I hated the game as much as humanly possible. Despite the few backsteps, a bunch of UI elements got improvements, as in combat, shifting positions and formations are given detailed information, and the effects of chakra building are far clearer, with a separate bar for each tier. At levels 25 and 50 respectively, a second and third overcharge bar are unlocked for each character, and by that point they can actually utilize them due to the larger chakra pools. The animation in the first game charged a singular bar. The lower the level you were, the slower it would charge up, and it would often cap if you went too hard because of how low your available chakra was. I'm still not a fan of the rubbing minigame, but at least the conveyance issue was fixed, so I fundamentally understand how it works now. That's all fairly surface level shit though. The only real change to combat was that party capacity's been reduced from 6 to 4, with 3 primary fellas and a single reserve. The backup can be switched in at any point and automatically fills in for fallen allies like the previous game, but with the larger roster, having fewer in combat seems silly. It's often the case that less is more, but with far more characters than the former title and 2 fewer slots, it's a tough call as to who to pick. Functionally, it's effectively the same, you just get 2 less mistakes, so to speak. Spitting in the face of this reduced roster utilization is the inclusion of in-battle summon monsters who fill in for the party. I only used these to test it out, but they were pathetically weak in comparison to the usable party members, so their inclusion is baffling. But they're far from the only baffling skills, as there are so many per character, but the viability of each is questionable, and the descriptions can be vague. Most of the big damage moves are literally described as big damage, so I guess that checks out, but there's little incentive to test the auxiliary techniques, as enemies die pretty fast, and a dead foe is much better than an ailed one. Not to mention how it's practically a JRPG tradition to make bosses immune to status ailments, rendering anything but direct attacks pretty useless. The bosses are actually quite pathetic, unlike the second game, but the final big bad did push my shit in and actually required me to rework my formations and equipment. Credit to Path of the Ninja 2 for requiring me to lightly use a few of the character upgrade systems, but with the amount of characters and how short the game is, you never really engage with it past a surface level. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is always disappointing to see many character progression systems that kinda synergize amongst themselves, yet never really get the chance to. Like, if there were one game you get autistic with, in addition to your standard equipment and bond systems, there's also weapon weightings, where a character has affinities with particular weapon types and is assigned a rank from S to D. Some weapons also have sub-effects to compensate for their relatively lower damage, such as a higher crit rate or being more effective against puppets. I didn't notice enough specific types to utilize this though, like maybe human types since there are ninja everywhere, but as far as I could see, there were minimal puppet enemies, which kinda defeats the point of that weapon ability. In saying that, each weapon also has varying damage output based on the row it's used in. It was nice to see viability for the back row attackers instead of the front row being the go-to for damage output. Ninja cards are secondary equipment that come with an assorted cost and can grant passive and executable abilities as well as a whole host of auxiliary effects. Each bloke has a point limit which increases with their level and can swap and change abilities to suit their needs. I used it mostly for flat stat increases and unlocking the super moves like Rasengan, but if a majority of the battles weren't mindlessly mashing A, I'm sure there'd be some utility there. The postgame is also quite lacking, which is where the aforementioned system would shine if given the opportunity. It allows you to summon extra characters such as Kakashi, Guy, Itachi, you know, the big boys, but they all have unchangeable levels, stats, and equipment, so it's kinda shit. Upon sparking up a conversation with Tsunade post-credits, you're prompted to select a male or female Anbu, who joins the party at level 1 and is effectively a stand-in for the player. This would have been a much better addition if it were done at the start of the game, allowing you to play with yourself. Insert from the get-go, but what is this game if not a missed opportunity? Like, yeah, it'd add an extra character to an already padded roster, but what's the point of a self-insert at the end of a game? What little endgame there was seemed to be focused around Wi-Fi battles, but I'd imagine that over a decade after the fact, the servers are long dead and there are more Nintendo DS consoles in landfills than in the hands of active Naruto fans who are definitely not playing this shit anymore. Sad thought, but that's the life cycle of a game that banks on any kind of network activity. It's all gotta come crumbling down at some point, and it's kinda depressing looking back. Path of the Ninja 2 is not worth your time. The first game is if you're absolutely thirsty for a Naruto RPG in English, as it's wholly inoffensive, but if you're really looking for something to help you bust, Chidori vs Rasengan is legit, and I wish they'd use that as a base for an amazing sequel instead of what we got. It had much better gameplay variants, a better party system and character distribution, and the difficulty curve coupled with the events it covered were far more enjoyable overall. Naruto gets a 0 out of 10. Go and watch Bleach instead. I'm just kidding. Do not watch Bleach.